Hi, good morning, everybody. Welcome to our webinar, Proactive Security in the Digital Age, based on key learnings from Log4j. Before we begin, kindly note that questions can be sent across at any time during the session. You can do so by using the Ask Questions widget in the screen. Our speakers will address the questions, but if we run out of time, your questions will be addressed over email. Next, your feedback is greatly appreciated. Please share them with us via the Take Survey widget. And for every successful survey submission, we will send across a new report by Frost & Sullivan titled An Enterprise Journey to a Secure Cloud, a Best Practices Guide. Today, we have 4 security experts sharing their learnings from Log4j, and most importantly, what can enterprises do? First, we have Daniel Ho, Associate Director of Sales Engineering from Singtel, who will share an overview of Log4j and the shifts in cybersecurity. Daniel will be interviewing 3 other guests we have today. First, Chris Thomas, Sales Engineer from ExtraHop. Chris brings with him 20 years of cyber experience with roles from frontline incident response, technical sales, to architecture and implementation consulting. Followed by Liz Ali Khan, a Senior System Engineer from Netskope, Asia. Over the past 10 years, Liz specializes in infrastructure and cloud security domain and has played instrumental roles in several critical large-scale projects. And lastly, from Tenable, we have Kenneth, Senior Security Engineer. Kenneth has close to 10 years of experience in cybersecurity. He's the youngest among the speakers, but has already established very important roles in Tenable. And he's an advocate of Active Directory security framework. Kenneth will be joined by his colleague Disney Cheng, another very experienced security engineer. Disney has 20 years of experience and has led projects across countries like Singapore, Hong Kong, China, Japan, and Australia, for example. All right. Without further ado, let's begin with Daniel. Take it away, Daniel.
Thank you, David. Hi, everyone. I'm really excited about today's discussions. And this sessions, our speaker will share their viewpoint about Log4j vulnerability and also how can they prepared to prevent the cyber attack. Before that, here's the format. I'm going to do a quick sharing to set context, get a baseline understanding of today's security trend, as well as a zero trust framework. And also from MSP perspective, I would like to establish a little bit common ground of the adoption of security service. And then I'll pass over to our speaker, and you can expect each speaker to have a floor about 20 minutes, and we will conduct a short Q&A session at the end of each session. And any questions during the webinar, please feel free to type them in the chat windows, and we will address them during the Q&A. Appreciate your time and make sure you ask a question. So before that, let's refresh our memory. And in December last year, the cybersecurity community went into a frenzy because of Log4j vulnerability, which is a major cybersecurity fraud that impacted almost all of the internet, government, and many organizations around the world. And we are scrambling to patch our system in fear that the fraud could be weaponized by attackers, taking remote control of our system. Definitely, we discussed a lot of the technical details of the remediation. Like this diagram is very popular. It highlighted how we can detect and prevent the Log4j or Log4j vulnerability. Essentially, we can see there's different opportunity to stop the attack through the kill chains approach. But I would like to take a step back. There's a lot of things that go wrong when it comes to trust in any third-party software, regardless whether it's open source or proprietary code. And open source definitely can change the way and speed companies make software, but it also makes security challenge showcased by Log4j. And you know, Log4j is a fundamental component that solves the locking problem, but you may end up have it because a component of the component that you use is utilizing Log4j. The supply chains relied at the difficulty of the detection. And so the software is everywhere. The industry is making a headway mitigate the risk software supply chains attacks by enhancing basic hygiene, which is the best form of defense. But companies need to get the mechanism to ensure the integrity of software and the code they adopt. But on the other hand, the sophisticated attackers are always a possibility, but it's most constantly fed into open source, which is in bind structure. And this issue also raised the concern about many government organizations, let's say the White House, also driving the security summits to discuss the open source security after the Log4j, actively work with those big companies, Google, Amazon, that discussing this open source security topic. And someone will talk about maybe the matching the volunteer with open source process, or even have the public or private sector partnership based on when and how they use the open source. But essentially, that's something we cannot change the ecosystem shortly, but we can explore probably there's some repeatable cyber attack based on this open source. And so let's step up further and look into the threat actors, like the sophisticated threat actor, how they impact to us, say, in terms of the cost of cybercrime to the global business. We are talking about a huge number, 8 trillion. And in terms of the ROI, exploit kits of the ransomware scheme, we can see a lot of growth, talking about more than thousands of percentage growth. And in terms of the median times of between the intrusion and detection, what we see is that we need at least 55 days to do so. And back to the basic, the lifeblood of the today's digital businesses is data, but it constantly under attack from skilled, organized cybercrime. And also what we can see in the market is the ransomware as a service, phishing, advanced botnet, and insider threat. But the problem is that many organizations must leave behind the false assumption that secure network. Is that the network are secure? That's a problem, right? So the current secure approach could be fall into to protect data as they build on the legacy network perimeter-based approach. So to back to the basics, that what we like to understand the definition of zero trust, but it's not something upon product or service we can go out to buy. Essentially, the key concept is that in order to trust, you must verify first. And this is talking about the assumption of which that the risk and inherent factor, both insider and outsider, right, in the network. And essentially, there's something, the model is a kind of the level ground implicitly of the trust, and also must be continuously evaluated. As this second model, it also guiding some principle of the multi-layer defense, such as how to reduce the risk to critical function and data, comprehensive security monitoring, and identify the malicious activity, and how to provide a granular and dynamic risk-based access control. Especially we don't have the unlimited resources, definitely we need to leverage the risk-based approach. And also a class principle, the principle of least privilege, to make sure that we have good shape of the access control. And we want to understand more how those organizations can move to zero trust. what we can see is that the zero trust model becomes the choice of the enterprise governments as a great solution to implement this to enhance their security posture. And it allows the evolution of the organization strategy. Let's say it also forces organizations to rethink their approach to secure data to meet the requirements, whatever the data privacy regulation, expectation from their client and business partner. But on the other hand, it also drives the risk mindset to those organizations which can see the opportunity to take the zero trust mindset. It's about adopting it best they can to fit their current or future states of infrastructure, which not to limited businesses is something the security enabled business to change the mindset based on the risk mindset organization. And one more thing is there's no one fits to all approach, meaning that someone will try to force certain process or technology that's maybe introduce more risk. So that we need to make sure that we understand the security posture, what kind of component can fit into your environment. Probably we discuss with some CISO C-level, discuss about the security topic. We always focused on the security maturity, where we are, especially in terms of the capability of detection and response, which we need to understand the current stage, like is it a reactive security, proactive security, or even go into the adaptive security. And there's key three main topics we consider to drive. Let's say, what is the ability to monitor and detect when respond, which is a key to reduce the risk of security exposure, definitely. And also security threat intelligence. And it also is key to prioritize the complex threat. Let's say this very popular topic about the virtual and rerun crisis that definitely we draw our attention to understand more the cyber intel. And more importantly, it's a shift to proactive threat hunting from response. What we can see how to go into the adaptive security is that we need the capability to do the threat hunting. So there's something we can drive this adaptive security through the proactive threat hunting from the response. Essentially, we need to consider the tools like EDR, NDR, SDR. We build the capability based on the security stack. And here, I would like Intel as an MSP perspective. I would like to highlight the security resiliency, how we position it and tackle it, work with clients to deal with this cyber resiliency topic from hybrid multi-cloud world. And essentially, we help the client to navigate today's advanced threat with different approach. Firstly, detection and response, including design and advising client internal threat response team, adding 24/7 monitoring capability. And second, threat protection. We're helping clients to establish and implement control that protect data, access, and user. And also we have the continuous testing by understanding the organization risk in today ever evolving the attack surface, discover, manage, and remediate vulnerability. In particular, we also provide both tactic and strategy service and product, depending on the desirable outcome, like our strategic architecture service that help answer the question, how can we ensure that you're maximizing the effectiveness of our security spending with regard to people, process, and technology? We offer the consulting and professional service as well as cyber awareness service, which can help you improve the effectiveness of your cloud security and transitional security architecture, enhance your security investment. And taking a step further, not only we can advise on what you can, how to require to change or remediate the security gap, we can also help to integrate, deploy the new technology, new process into your environment and make it better, or even we can help you to transform, whether it's designing a new digital technology stack, revamping your security program and personnel. And most important thing is, as a managed security provider, the managed security service is a key to help to going on the maintain the resiliency in your security program. This is where we can help to with threat protection, security testing, and technology management to augment your team and scale in a cost-effective manner. And last but not least, to ensure the service and product remain up to date, what we need is the understanding of the threat landscape. And we feel, including the industry-leading research team, intelligence into everything we do, so that the organization remain the resilience in the age of advanced threat. So that's something from the MS's perspective, what we can do with the client about cyber resiliency. I think we have a very fantastic topic at the stage, understanding Log4j, and also we share a little bit about the zero trust framework as a baseline. So I think this is a great thing to, as a start, to share more insight from our speaker. So firstly, I would like to introduce our first speaker, Chris. He's a fantastic security expertise in the industry, through a lot of projects in terms of the IR, in terms of how to work with clients to implement the security stack solution. So thank you, Chris, to get involved sharing. And he's joined ExtraHop as a senior security consultant, helping many clients to develop the capability in terms of network detect and respond. So, hi, Chris. Yeah.
Hi, Daniel. Good morning. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. So I think it's a good to have the chance to discuss with you, understand more your insights about the current security landscape and the solutions that. So there's a quick warm-up. I would like to ask a question about your insight about the Log4j, because
yep.
we know we talk a lot of how to update the software, how to do the remediation about the Log4j. But moving forward, apart from away from the prevention alone, mindset, how can you position it to enhance the capability in terms of detection and response and contain approach? That would be great to get your insight about that. Yeah.
So I think you hit the nail on the head there, in that for a lot of people, Log4j especially was either a wake-up call or more of a reinforcement of what they thought, that prevention-only mindset really isn't enough these days, and it's not working. Like that idea that we can prevent every single attack and prevent an attacker getting into the network. Ideally, yes, we'd want to do that, but there's a realization now that an attacker that's motivated enough and resourced enough, maybe it's an APT, a nation state that's been given a mission that they need to find a way in, and they're going to find it, or a ransomware group with organized crime, right? They're going to find a way in, that we need to augment what we're doing from a prevention standpoint and have more of a capability for detection and response as well. Otherwise, we're playing this endless game of whack-a-mole of new vulnerability, new exploit, new technology comes out to mitigate that particular exploit, that vulnerability, but then it happens again. So it's a never-ending cycle. So if we can break that cycle by actually spending a bit more focus and attention at looking at post-compromise activities, right? What are the kinds of activities that an attacker is going to do once they've got that initial compromise? I think we're going to be in a better position to detect more and more threats, and even threat actors that may already be inside an organization as well. So it's important to move away from that just prevent-only mindset.
Yeah, that's good. I think we need to have a good, better mindset to tackle the cybersecurity topic. Yeah.
And so with Log4j, so we did provide some detection capabilities within ExtraHop quite quickly. And in our platform, we have a thing called threat briefings, which we push out. And I'll just show you user interface. So it's quite a prominent user interface. We publish these when industry-wide threats are uncovered. And just last week, we actually pushed a new threat briefing around any Russian threat actors. So looking for particular tools or techniques being used by potential Russian state actors. But these threat briefings serve multiple purposes. I like to refer to them as the answer to the Monday morning problem. Right? When I was working as an analyst, one of the worst things is the boss comes in on Monday morning and she says, hey, I had some time on the weekend and I read this newspaper report or saw this article on CNA, I was watching it, that talked about Log4Shell and Log4j. Tell me, how does it affect us? Have we seen any attacks, right? And so as an analyst, if you're not quite finished your Monday morning coffee yet, you might be on the back foot. And so you're like, oh, I need to go and do some research. I need to find out what is this threat and how does it affect us? So that's what we try and do within our product to help our analysts, our friends in the community, actually be able to answer these questions. So as an example, here's the start of the threat briefing, in this case for Log4Shell. And I have to admit, I'm still on the fence as to the pronunciation of whether it's Log4j or Log4j, right, depending on who you talk to in different parts of the incident response community. I think Log4j makes more sense. But the first part of the threat briefing gives us a description, right, easy to read, understanding of what the vulnerability is, details there, links to the CVE to get more references, and information about how the attacker might actually be able to use this to compromise systems in the network. So, and this was a particularly interesting vulnerability because there were many aspects that we needed to be aware of to look at not just an injection attempt, but whether a compromise was actually successful or not. And so then the threat briefing, we go into a few layers of detail, but just before I do that, I'll show you what we're looking at from a sort of broad classification, or broadly speaking, the 4 high-level things that we look for as a way of being able to detect this kind of activity. First of all is looking for that actual, let me just grab my pen here. Right. So layer 1 here, we're looking at the actual injection attempt that's being done by the attacker, so trying to inject that JNDI string, as you mentioned on your slide earlier, into a field somewhere inside, not just in the URI, but somewhere in the payload, maybe in the headers for HTTP. In this case, we see it being injected as a user agent field. And we see the attempted thing. Now, depending on how your internet-facing systems have been published, maybe this is available over HTTP, or maybe it's secured behind HTTPS, in which case you'd need to use some of the decryption features within ExtraHop to be able to actually see this communication. So we can provide that visibility there. What we actually do is we see the JNDI injection attempt and we see the actual IP address or the domain that's attempting to be injected as part of this first part of the attack. And we load that into a table in memory so we can use that in subsequent detections to see if we see any actual requests going outbound to that particular IP address or domain. So it means that we get that, first of all, detection of an attempted exploit, but then also confirmation of, yes, the exploit was successful because we are seeing outbound activity to that IP address or that domain, which is pretty cool. Another aspect we can use is just looking to find, are there any external connections to any LDAP servers? In most organizations, that's a pretty rare event. It's not something that's normally observed in regular network traffic. So if we see a bunch of systems suddenly trying to connect to external LDAP servers, that can be quite interesting. And this is a key aspect for this particular vulnerability and exploit, because normally when we see an exploit attempt against a host, we then see that host being the one to communicate as a compromised system. But with Log4j, as you said earlier, it could be many layers deep in the application stack where the actual part of the application that parses the logs or parses this information actually sits. So we don't know which of the systems inside the network may actually call out as a successful vulnerability or a successful exploit. So we look for all the external LDAP connections to be able to see if there was anything there that triggered anything. And then lastly, another aspect is actually looking for the file that's being downloaded as part of that download of the malicious payload to be able to see, if there's any executable file being downloaded, including a Java class file. So we incorporate that as part of our detection there. So they're the four main techniques that we were using for being able to detect any exploit attempts, as well as any instances of successful exploitation that we include into our threat briefing. So as a quick pictogram to show that, in the threat briefing itself, it's actually published here. This is the rest of that screen after the initial introduction. So we can see here the different detections. So first of all, the meat straight away at the top, the outbound Log4j shell activity. Did we see any successful exploitations? We highlight that first. And in this, from a lab environment, we can see, yes, there was a successful connection from a host from our environment into an external server using an IP address or domain that was parsed out of that injection attempt. So we saw a successful outbound connection. We saw 2 potential attempts, for inbound connections to use that exploit. And then also the monitoring there for the external LDAP server and that executable file download I mentioned on the graphic before. But a couple of other things that we threw in as well to look for, because they're strange behaviors, things we don't normally see. So monitoring for connections to external Java RMI, or remote method invocation protocol. Again, not something you typically see in day-to-day network traffic leaving the organization, going to the internet. So do we see any of that happening? And then similarly for IIOP, and I have to admit, before this threat briefing came out, I'd never heard of IIOP, right? Inter-orb protocol being used for distributed Java applications and Java systems. So again, do we see that connecting from anywhere inside our organization to an external site? It could be an indication of a system that's been compromised using this vulnerability. So I think that's the different ways that we put into the system to be able to detect not just that injection attempt, but also monitoring for any successful exploitation as well, which is where we look at that whole idea of not just looking for that initial access and trying to prevent the access, but detection and monitoring to see if there was any successful compromise.
Yeah, that's great. I think we learned about the capability of a network defense and response approach, and also get the insights with some fantastic functional feature that we can leverage the platform to do so. And moving forward, I would like to understand more, especially the end game of the hacker. Probably they would go into the client's environment to trigger the ransomware attack. And how we can see or leverage the solution to detect and disrupt the ransomware actor before they really trigger the impacted attacks to the organization?
Yeah, so shifting to ransomware, I guess Log4j, we were kind of lucky so far in many ways in that the most reported exploitation that I saw ended up, there was some group that was deploying some crypto miner malware, right, that got deployed on systems that were compromised. We haven't heard, or at least I haven't seen recently, any reports of any major attack or any major exploitation. But what we expect to see is Log4j just becomes another vulnerability that the attackers add into their toolkit for that initial compromise. So it won't be long until we do see actors using Log4j as that initial access mechanism to then start their ransomware campaigns. And looking at ransomware, quite often I hear the saying that defenders need to be right all of the time, but attackers only need to be right once. And that's, I have to admit, I hate that saying. It gets it fires me up because it's such a defeatist way to look at things. And if I saw that, I said, well, yeah, you're right. We have to be right all the time. There's no chance we can do that. Why even bother? So what we need to do is turn that equation around. So look at how we can do that. And NDR is a great way of being able to do that with the visibility that it can provide. But to understand how, I guess we need to look at ransomware, what an actual ransomware kill chain looks like. Right? We talk about the ideas of lateral movement and mid-game, etc. So we've done a bit of work modeling out ransomware campaigns. And we've done a lot of work, especially working with organizations that we're either doing response services for or where we've found early detections, but also using resources like the DFIR report, which you run on the call. If you haven't been to the site, I urge you to go to dfirreport.com. There's a resource run by incident responders that put up great teardowns of investigations that they've performed and analysis they've performed, which steps through the different activities that they see as part of a successful campaign. And what it boils down to, and there's been a lot of analogies at the moment using chess as an example. I think the Queen's Gambit Netflix series that took the world by storm, where they talk about the idea of an opening. And there are different ways you can open a game, but you don't put all your eggs in the basket of your opening, right? Most of the activity happens in the mid-game, right? That's where the longest part of the play goes for. And in our sense, that's where we have the most chance of being able to detect an attacker in the network. If we start off with this initial open access, and this is where we could say, that preventative mindset and that whack-a-mole sort of takes place. Because we try and prevent phishing, we try and monitor for stolen credentials or stop drive-by downloads, and monitor for remote desktop protocol. Right? All of those things are different things we're trying to look for. We then get to things like initial access broker is a term that's being used now, which basically just refers to the fact that the initial compromise quite often can be outsourced, either by the threat actors from a ransomware campaign, or from a nation state, maybe there's a particular unit that's set up just to do the initial compromise. They achieve their mission, they hand it over to the next team that have their scripts for doing the mid-game aspect. So if we turn our focus away from that initial access and look at this mid-game, because this is going to be consistent no matter what the actual end game might be. Right? The other aspect we look at is often trying to find the latest MD5 hash or SHA-1 hash of the ransomware file or the Mimikatz file that might be used as part of a campaign. That can be changed very easily and is different for every different attack. So there's no point looking for or relying on that as a way of being able to detect attack. And in the ransomware sense, if you're just looking for the executable, then it's probably too late by that stage because it's already inside the network and it's already been copied around and being executed. So if we take our attention to this mid-game area, this gives us the best chance to actually detect an attacker once they're inside the network after that initial compromise, but before they get to their end game or their extortion cycle. So it's those things that we can do sort of looking across the kill chain around reconnaissance and enumerating targets, right? Looking for users that are trying to do domain privilege escalation, get that domain admin rights, looking for the lateral movement, many clients talking to many servers they don't normally talk to, or servers talking to other servers they don't normally talk to. Right? Command and control, being able to detect that from a network perspective, and also that data staging aspect where we see large amounts of data being copied around across the network from databases or file shares once that critical information has been identified and it's being copied and being prepared for either exfiltration for the use of stealing for state secrets in an APT sense, or the data being exfiltrated so it can be part of that double whammy attack from the criminal organizations where we're starting to see exploitation and extortion as the first prong, pay me my ransom or I'll release this information on the internet, that happens along with I'm going to encrypt and destroy all your files. Right? So we have those different aspects that we can actually detect. Where we have visibility, we have the ability to monitor for these activities, and that can give us that tip-off that there's something happening inside the organization and attackers inside looking around trying to find the data before it gets to that destructive aspect of the attack. And this is how we can flip that dilemma we spoke about earlier, right? The defender's dilemma, that intrusions are inevitable, defenders have to be right 100% of the time, attackers only once. As I said, I hate that. I much prefer to look at it from the aspect of the intruder's dilemma. Right? Once they're actually inside the network, just wait to get the extra animation up. There we go. So the intruder's dilemma, look at it the other way around. Right? Once the attacker's inside the network, that's when they have to be right all of the time. Otherwise, they start leaving footprints around, leaving things that we can detect. But from a defender's perspective, this should be where it's flipped, in that we should have a much better idea of our environment. We should know where our assets are, where our critical information is, and be able to understand, if I was an attacker in the network, where would I need to go? What would I be looking for? What systems would I be looking for to carry out my mission? So hopefully as defenders, we've got that visibility, we've got that understanding of our environment, so that in this case, the attacker is the one that has to be right all the time, and versus us having to be right all the time. So that's the way we can flip that over, by having that visibility and that understanding of our environment, so that we can monitor the attacker and see when they trip up instead.
Yeah, great points. I think back to our zero trust framework, what we can see that we can leverage the NDR solutions to get the full visibility. And in terms of level trust always verify, how can we make use the NDR's solution and platform to achieve this goal?
So I think zero trust is one of those terms that has been around for a long time in different guises. And I've been in cybersecurity, well, for over 20 years, since before it was even called cybersecurity. Back then it was just IT security, right? Or information security. And we've always had that, trust but verify approach to a lot of things on the network. I think though now the current focus on zero trust has taken that even further into not just trust but verify, but never trust and always verify, right? So constantly checking permissions, checking whether systems are authorized to be able to perform, the things that they're trying to do. And I think the key aspect for a lot of people when trying to implement a zero trust strategy or a zero trust network architecture is understanding the scope, right? Where are the systems that need to be controlled under zero trust? But also, how do you verify, right? Verify always, how do you verify that the only connections to those systems are coming from the trusted paths where they should be coming from, whether that's from a Netskope appliance or a broker, all the activity to my application should be coming from that Netskope device. How do I monitor to see if there's any other activity, right? Any other connections trying to be made from other devices to that device? So it's about verifying that the zero trust architecture is in place. And part of doing that is understanding in your environment where the critical information is and what the data flows are as well, right? When people look at deploying technology such as NDR, quite often it's focused on the north-south channel, right? People coming into the internet and then maybe going from the DMZ into the organization. That gives us a limited view in the types of use cases or attacks that can be detected, right? It's your initial compromise, your command and control, and the data exfiltration. A much bigger part of what we can monitor for in that attack campaign, in that mid-cycle, is there's other activities which are focused more on the east-west traffic, right? Maybe from that compromised user workstation communicating internally into the critical servers and the data center. So the reconnaissance, the scanning, the brute force, that's what we can monitor for inside that east-west corridor, which helps to verify that any connection should only be coming from the trusted zero trust pathway as opposed to any other unauthorized communication paths. So best way for looking at NDR in the scope of zero trust is being able to verify, well, first of all, monitor and verify that the zero trust policies are being adhered to as they should be.
Yeah, great. Good, very good point. And by the way, I can see the chat room, there's a Q&A question from our audience. Let me repeat the question. Where do you think NDR fit now that everyone is talking about the SDR? I think it's a very interesting topic. Yeah.
Interesting question. And yeah, I wish I had $1 for every time I've been asked that question in the last 6 months. It is a very topical question. And I think the first thing is when you look at XDR is, well, what is XDR? If you ask, I saw a great quote the other day from an analyst that said, if you ask 3 analysts for a definition of XDR, the best you'll get is 2 of them agreeing that the third one's completely wrong. So the definition of XDR is up in the air, and different vendors have different ways that they're positioning it. Most people look at it as being extended EDR or EDR plus. I look at it as being, it's about looking at the capabilities that you have inside your organization for threat detection and understanding where the gaps might be. And the best approach is to look at XDR as more of a strategy rather than as an individual product, and say, as a strategy, NDR fits in very well as part of that overall view of having the visibility to detect those threats as part of an XDR framework. And so along that line, we're membership in a couple of different alliances, the Open XDR Alliance, which was formed by Exabeam, right? So we're a founding member of that alliance, so working with other technology partners to build out the integrated best of breed approach to solving or addressing XDR, as opposed to just coming into a single vendor lock-in approach where you may struggle. You may get the convenience of a single tool, but each component of that tool may not be up to standard, right? It might not be as good as a best of breed point solution that you could use. So we're approaching it as an alliance perspective, so part of that Open XDR Alliance, and also part of the CrowdStrike XDR Alliance as well. They recognize the use of NDR fitting into their overall strategy for an XDR approach as well. So definitely fits into that approach and provides that complementary view of what you might get from an endpoint with EDR, especially when there are devices that you can't install an agent on, right? There's always a few devices, that Unix box sitting in the corner that's been sitting there for years that nobody knows what it does, but no one's going to turn it off, right? Let alone install an agent on it, as well as BYOD or IoT devices where you can't install an agent. So network visibility provides that complementary view to give that complete coverage, to give you an XDR view where you can't have an agent.
Yeah. I mean, but thank you, Chris, your insights. I think that we have a good, fruitful discussion on the NDR topic. So thank you, Chris, again.
Cool.
And
Thanks,
now
Daniel.
I would like to thank you very much. Now I would like to over to our second speaker. Okay. Hey, hi, Liz.
Hey, hi. Hi, Daniel.
Yeah. Thank you for joining this webinar. And this is our security professional, has more than 10 years IT experience, focusing on implementing and advise the design, of course, Asia Pass in terms of the SaaS or SSD solution, and he currently holds the position as a senior system engineer in Asia at Netskope. So yeah, we're fantastic to get this to join our discussion. Right. Again, back to our frames, we talk a lot about the Log4j, and we'd like to understand more from as a cloud security service provider's perspective. Could you share your insights about the Log4j vulnerability? And also, I think as many clients are concerned about any impacts to their solution provider, and Netskope as a cloud security provider, is that Log4j vulnerability impact to Netskope Cloud? Would like to, I think it's a very interesting topic. Would like to understand more from your side.
Sure. Okay, so basically I summarized what Log4Shell or Log4j is all about. I mean, I put it into bullet forms. So I think Daniel did, and you also did a very good explanation of what Log4j is actually. It's essentially an application, and Log4Shell or Log4j is essentially the vulnerability itself. So Log4Shell or Log4j is a vulnerability in the Apache Log4j Java-based logging library. So has an unauthenticated RC vulnerability. Essentially targets the 2.0 beta 9 up to 2.14.1. It could allow a complete system takeover on the vulnerability system itself. And one of the things that I want to highlight as well is the bug has also the maximum CVSS score of 10. So this essentially also reflects the importance of the ease of exploitation. The vulnerability can be triggered by an unauthenticated attacker that can essentially log messages or log message parameters in Log4j. So with that statement itself, it becomes trivial to essentially say that the exploit has the attacker can be triggered by a bug by sending malicious string when they essentially get logged into the application as well. To your second point, on a high level, Netskope essentially also takes pride, and we also do a continuous assessment of our environments as well. So we essentially take protection of our customers very seriously, and our assessments has confirmed, we did an internal assessment as well, that all of Netskope's products, especially services including our New Age, which is essentially our private data center, and all supporting customer software, so our Netskope clients, our appliances, and essentially our gateways and infrastructures as well, hasn't been identified to be impacted by any of the listed Apache Log4j vulnerabilities as well. So back to you, Daniel.
Yeah, so I think again, as our theme in this webinar, we talk a lot about the zero trust. Can you share how can we improve the impact for future, especially this kind of open source vulnerability, in particular to reduce the risk or even attack surface for those 0 days at vulnerability through the SASE, or how to leverage the alignment between zero trust and the SASE?
Yeah, I think that's a very valid point as well. So one of the key things I think that we spoke about, or essentially was highlighted earlier as well, is to essentially apply a zero trust framework when securing environments. That essentially becomes key. So when we look at the slide itself, there are 3 key components around it. We have identity, application, and data. So when we look at it into a context and we break it down into the cloud world as well, you need to essentially tie a lot of different contexts around all of these 3 different pointers. One is the identity. In order to identify a user, the permissions of the user, and also at the same time to have the ability to essentially put a risk score behind a user. Why? Is because a user essentially traverses through an environment, and when it goes into the cloud space, it starts to be a context where you're starting to allow the users to access certain applications, be it whether the application is a private state application, own internal application, or an external application that's a SaaS application that your organization subscribes to, or it could be a private application hosted in cloud. The other thing is we also need to understand the impact or the introduction of applications as well. So the reason why I use that statement is because every application, it's by its own form designed to essentially address a specific task or need for an organization. So when it's designed, there's always a part where an application can essentially also introduce risk to an organization. So if I'm using a third-party application, so what can that application provide to my organization in terms of benefits? But at the same time, when it was developed, is there any part of a vulnerability of anything that could potentially be an exploit to my environment? So it breaks down into that context as well. And then on a security perspective, what can I apply on the application to control my users, to limit access, to essentially say, I want to stop a share, I want to essentially allow a sync, I want to approve, I want to have a permission where I can essentially approve a request from a specific user itself. And on top of that context, when you marry these 2 together, the last component is essentially data. What data do I allow my users to send to an application? If it's too sensitive, do I essentially want to secure the information or prevent that from going into the application as well? So all of this becomes part of something that we essentially say, in order to reduce the risk surface area, the best way is essentially to operationalize data protection across the board. Yeah. Okay, so on that context as well, I wanted to talk about essentially data-centric security model. Why? Is because when we apply a zero trust framework approach when securing environments, if we look at the slide, the best way to reduce the risk is essentially to ensure contextual flow between a data and an application. But at the same time, with a massive growth of cloud computing and explosion of mobile devices across the board, it becomes very, very challenging to apply all of these controls as well. Why? Is because it's in a habit of mind, I think it's for everyone, right? Especially with all the news coming out, with all the recent incidents occurring. When I pick up my mobile device, typically the first thing I want to do is I want to access information. I'll look at news. And when we do that, we essentially start to become individuals that crave for more and more information. So if you apply that concept into business as well, when I'm searching for something, I'm doing a task, I tend to try and extract as much information as possible to essentially perform my daily task. So that way I can deliver better results as well. But if you flip that mindset, it can also be a negative impact for the organization as well. Why? Is because if they extract more information that they are not supposed to access, it can become a challenge for the organization as well. So when we look at it in that context, the best way to essentially approach control is essentially to implement a risk-based zero trust access model. Why? Is because legacy mindsets on policy controls is essentially black and white. You have allow and you have deny. It's essentially very, very straightforward. But in today's world, the best way is essentially to look at a trust model. Why? Is because trust is essentially observant, contextual, and adaptive. It's not just black and white as in the past. And at the same time, in terms of an entity perspective, if you apply the zero trust model, essentially no entity can essentially assume implicit trust, and the components used by to establish trust essentially has to be assessed at all times. So what does that mean? So ultimately, in a zero trust perspective, when you apply restrictions across the board, or when you apply the key thing that you want is essentially visibility. And when you apply a risk-based zero trust approach, you're not only looking at allowing or denying access or to information, but at the same time, you can start to validate the identity of a user. Where is he located, the identity of the application that he's trying to access, or essentially the websites, the device or the model that he's essentially using to access, whether it's a managed device, unmanaged device. And based off his behavior over the past 30 days, for example, you can essentially allow that access to a state information, maybe hosted in a SaaS application or in a private application as well. So with that said, on the zero trust perspective, when we bring it into cloud, there is a little bit of a different in terms of context as well. One of the key things that I wanted to highlight as well is basically when you want to apply zero trust into cloud, that's where you start to hear the terminology SASE essentially being brought up a lot into the conversation as well. So what is SASE? There's and how is it different from zero trust? Essentially, the two of them are very similar. The biggest difference between SASE and zero trust framework is that SASE is a core component of designing zero trust approach into securing access to an application, regardless of it being a cloud app or private app. Zero trust is essentially a framework that is implemented across the environment itself. So it can be on an endpoint, it can be on a network. But when you want to secure it into cloud, that's where you hear the terminology SASE being essentially brought up. SASE being a framework, it encompasses a lot of different components, network-based components or network security-based components as well. So that's where you start to hear solutions like CASB, SD-WAN, private access, isolation, etc., etc. Yeah.
Yeah, great. Because I think it's good to we developed the idea between the zero trust and SASE. But as you know, there's many organizations going through their cloud journey, adopting multi-cloud or hybrid cloud environment and solution. And how in particular to reducing the risk of critical vulnerability, what can we do, say, any or even or SSD approach?
Okay, so in terms of the approach itself, I mean, the best way to look at it is where possible, always update and patch. So I mean, that's basically the fundamentals when you're looking at securing your own internal applications as well. But another approach is if you're running an internal application that cannot be immediately patched, or you cannot essentially mitigate the risks of exploitation by limiting the access to the application as well, you can start to look at private access solutions. So Netskope, we do have a private access solution that can essentially make private apps invisible so to external attackers who seek to exploit vulnerability services as well. So how we essentially do that is we apply the zero trust model, and we essentially have something called a publisher that's front-facing the application, regardless of whether it's hosted on-premise or in an IaaS environment. So it could be in AWS, Azure, etc., etc. So what we are doing is we're essentially advertising the application only to a particular user based off the state of the device, the permissions, the adaptive control of that particular user, and to ensure that whatever that's connected through to the application itself is essentially secured via a tunnel. So this essentially helps to reduce the risk, or that if a compromised user or device essentially are exploited, to essentially access the vulnerable services itself. Yeah, and the last thing that I wanted to highlight as well is essentially Netskope also provide a layered protection against malware. So this is also one of the key aspects when you're looking at solutions as well, to ensure that they have fast scan, standard threat protection, or deep scan, advanced threat protection like sandboxing, etc., to essentially ensure that any connections to a particular application is also secure as well.
Yeah, Chris. I think as a whole, there's many cloud applications used in today's for many enterprises. But how can we quickly identify and manage the use of a cloud application, regardless of whether they are managed or unmanaged, and how to prevent the sensitive data being exfiltrations from IT environment? How can we rely on the cloud security capability?
Okay, so as you mentioned, right, when we look at statistics, or we also did our own network threat research as well. So that's essentially published late last year as well. So we do see a rising trend in applications being adopted. So one of the key things is, yes, there could be a huge volume of applications that is essentially being used by an organization. But we narrowed down that number to 805 distinct applications. So the reason why we say that is because if you look at Office 365, they offer multiple services as well. So that essentially becomes one still distinct application. You're looking at a specific domain, example like office.com, and you can never block it as well. When we start to look at that distinct number, the next context that we also did some research on is, if you notice on the right, there is something called 74% data loss via G drive, personal instance. So this is something quite interesting when we did our research as well, is typically there is a point in time where when a user actually leaves the environment, that's where the highest amount of exploitation happens. So they do their backup, they extract their information. And we actually saw this and we rated that, 74% of data loss essentially goes to a personal instance of G drive. So it's going to their own, leads at gmail.com, etc. So the other challenge is when we start to see these huge volumes in terms of, information that's actually going out or, extra data out from environment itself, we start to see the need of, something to be more flexible and agile in terms of addressing all of these cloud applications environment as well. So no longer are you looking for, a typical policy controls that's typically found in Swix or firewall that doesn't stop. You are starting to look at adaptive controls where it can essentially address a wide range of applications, and it's essentially designed for specific applications in point of time. So you have point solutions at the same time, a framework that addresses all of it. So that's where SASE comes into the equation and something called SSE. When we look at SSE, I wanted to introduce SSE is because it was recently introduced, I think, less than a month ago under the SASE framework. So SSE is essentially a component that's part of SASE as a framework. So if you want to look at cloud conversations in terms of security, that's the key component on security is where you essentially start to talk about something called SSE as a component. Bear in mind, it's a main component, but there's still sub features in that component to essentially address specific requirements moving forward. So what is SSE? So SSE is essentially what we call security service edge. The key reason why Gartner also released an SSE quadrant as well is because, and essentially merged the CASB quadrant and the SWIC quadrant into SSE, is because it addresses 4 key pointers: the convergence of security capabilities in cloud, the ability to support remote workers, whether they are on premise, whether they are in office, whether they're using a managed device, unmanaged device, and the key idea of SSE is also to reduce complexity. So instead of having multiple point solution, is there an offering that essentially can address a managed device, unmanaged device, a front-facing an application via a managed device? So like say, instead of deploying a reverse proxy, is there other methods where you can essentially secure users when they're accessing application as well? And then the last point is essentially to improve the experience as well. So this is where essentially SSE comes into the equation. So the whole SSE offering is essentially to benefit a customer, to ensure that when they are going into any cloud applications, they are essentially, SSE is essentially able to offer the benefits of both cloud and data security with a single instance, and also provide contextual awareness, whether it's a managed or unmanaged state, via a single console. So essentially it's offering a single pass architecture. When we look at it from a single pass architecture itself, we are looking at something called SSE platform. So looking at the SSE platform itself, one of the key components that we start to look at or start to drive into that conversation is, regardless of the state of a device, so be it whether it's an unmanaged device, a remote user, whether traffic's coming in from a HQ, before it hits a certain application, it needs to go through some sort of an intelligent platform that can essentially understand, at the same time also provide microservices to ensure that it's going through the standard advanced threat protection, the data protection, and also apply something called adaptive zero trust that I spoke about earlier as well. So this is where essentially an intelligent platform can come in and address unique use cases regardless of where the user is going to. So whether it's going to a public cloud, a SaaS application, or essentially going to the typical web as well, it starts to span out from where the application is hosted into a private data center, at the same time applying all the microservices that you've essentially implemented as a blanket policy across the board, at the same time to whatever particular component of SSE that user is essentially going to use when they're doing their daily tasks. So if they're going to a SaaS application, that's where essentially it touches on to a CASB component in SSE. If they're going into to essentially the generic web, to maybe a specific website, etc., that's not owned by the organization, it goes through the suite component of SSE. If you're utilizing a SaaS platform, that's where you can essentially do posture check or on SSPM checks, so to ensure that you're in line with industry best practices, and at the same time also apply that into public cloud, which is the CSPM component as well. So the entire SSE component or the framework or the platform itself is to essentially address 4 key components, which is the 4 key outcomes that derive from key use cases. So it is there to essentially design and provide visibility across securing access towards the web, like what I talked about earlier. It's there to essentially help detect and mitigate threats, and also at the same time ensure connectivity regardless of where your users is located as well. So the last thing essentially is to also implement DLP controls across all of these solutions as well. So this is also one of the key components. And when you start to implement the zero trust methodology, the adaptive policies, this essentially paints out the picture across all of these 4 use cases as well. So I know I'm going a little bit fast, but I think essentially I just wanted to summarize some of these key pointers as well. So the whole concept of SSE is to essentially provide that whole foundation of zero trust into cloud. So regardless of what application you're using, you have the ability to have adaptive access controls that's essentially in line with the application you're using. At the same time, also understand the risks of each of your users and what it entails to the organization, so that you can understand what accounts are compromised and what are essentially a healthy state of a risk level for each of your individual users. So that way you can essentially have a baseline, and essentially gives you that whole openness and visibility across your entire environment. So I just wanted to touch one last note from the recent Gartner quadrant as well, is by 2026, 50% of organizations will essentially prioritize advanced data security features. So for inspecting data at rest and in motion when doing their selection for SSE as well. So this is essentially up from 15% of 2021. So I think I'll leave it back to you, Daniel.
Yeah, thank you for insight. We can develop the idea about the SASE and SSD, so that all of us can have a better understanding about that concept. That's a great idea. And okay, let me see. So I think it's good to have time to pass to our third speaker. Okay, again, thank you for your support for this session. Yeah. Thank you much.
No worries. Happy to help. Thanks. Cheers.
So now moving forward, I'd like to introduce our distinguished speaker from Tenable, Disney and Kenneth. Definitely they have a strong expertise in terms of vulnerability management and Active Directory security. They have very good insights and real-life experience of helping the clients to work on the vulnerability management and AD security project in Azure Plat, and also with strong understanding about Microsoft Active Directory. So yeah, hi, Disney and Kenneth. Yeah.
Hello, Daniel. Thank you.
Hello.
Hey, Daniel.
And
Thanks for the intro.
Attendees. Yep. So
yeah, great to speak to you. Yeah.
Kenneth, so because we got a little bit short of time, maybe we skip a bit on the Log4j, Log4Shell stuff, because I guess a lot of people heard that multiple times already. But I think a lot of like customer may interesting why like Log4j or Log4Shell will affect AD. Is there anyone? Could you share a bit on this?
Yeah, sure. So as everyone know, Log4j and Log4Shell affects Java, and it's basically a vulnerabilities that exist in the way that Java Log4j communicates with the backend server that allows certain type of commands to be able to be executed without any checking or without any filtering, right? So most of the time, when you have a chance to run, or when you have a chance, so to speak, to send a command to the server, you can basically send any commands to the server to ask for any information you want. And one of those informations that you may ask for, and one of the most prized asset that you will want to ask for, is from the Active Directory. So when you have a backdoor like that, you can ask Active Directory for anything. And not just that, right? Because not just asking for something, but you can also ask Active Directory to make the necessary change for you through this particular backdoor. And that's why we have seen some of our current customer are scrambling around to identify during that time frame when Log4j was being introduced and also being in the news. They are trying to identify whether there's any backdoor in the Active Directory that is being utilized. So, like I said just now, the information from an Active Directory with a standard user account is very open, right? So the Active Directory, if you do not know, and I'm pretty sure a lot of people do not know this, is that as a user, as a standard user account, even with your own user account with Active Directory, you'll be able to use that information, use that login information and the credentials to ask your AD to send you almost everything, right? So you can ask your AD, what is my security level? What is the access of server that I have? Or what is the access of someone else, right? If you want to find out if your CEO is an owner of a particular PC, you can do so. If you want to find out if a server or workstation in your organizations, who are the owner, who are the security, who are the people that can change the ownership of those servers, AD will happily tell you that, right, with your own read-only user account, right? But obviously with Log4Shell, that changes the whole thing, because not only now you are able to read from the Active Directory, combining with the AD misconfigurations in Active Directory and the CVE that have been introduced with Log4Shell, now with the combination of all these pathways, you are able to change your Active Directory. So over here, there's an attack path, and we'll talk more about attack path in a bit, right? So attackers now are able to use the CVE, which is the Log4j and Log4Shell, in combination with some of the AD common misconfiguration, which we'll talk about that, what are the common misconfiguration as well. You are able to change the Active Directory server to inject backdoor or to receive data or to do a privilege of escalation attack, as our counterpart and the previous speakers have mentioned, domain dominance attack as well could happen. And all of those things could have been prevented if we have used a good vulnerability management, not only on the Active Directory, but as well as the server itself as well. Next. Yeah, so this is what we were talking about just now. So what is basically a zero trust, right? So when we talk about zero trust, we want to ensure that everything is proactive. And I believe the speakers before us were speaking about proactive as well. So I want to ensure proactive. And when it comes to Active Directory, being proactive is very important, because if you have noticed how often your Active Directory gets changed, you will notice that Active Directory gets changed very often. Every day there are hundreds of changes on a normal basis. Active Directory configuration gets changed on 100 times per day, right? On our typical customer.
Yeah, and that's very correct. Because I remember last time when we having a demo in a customer site, and very surprisingly how they provision the account now is automated, but they don't aware that there is a flaw in their script and create some security weakness in their account. Sorry, of course, we cannot disclose that customer name, but I think that is pretty obvious. Like if your organization, use AD for a while, and that's very common, then we see a lot of actual case that is happening.
Yeah, we'll talk about more of that proactive as well, but the changes doesn't just make, it's not just from user themselves. It's not usually a manual change, but most of the time it's because your HR application is making the changes, your IT and someone else's that bought the software, the vendor is making some changes, or maybe in the SolarWinds cases, SolarWinds actually changes Active Directory on a regular basis as well. So those are the changes that we are not sure. No one is actually checking for them. And a second about zero trust is real time. And when it comes to real time, a lot of solutions today, we'll talk about that a bit as well, are able to look for changes in Active Directory. But are you actually looking at the security analysis of it, right? Which is the third point. Are you looking at the Active Directory change to identify security check? Is the Active Directory check make sense in your environment? It may make sense in a generic and lab environment, but is it making sense in your actual production environment as well? And if the change happened in your environment, are they opening up different security loophole in your environment, right? So we'll just move to the next slide. So what exactly is proactive, all right? So proactive essentially means, in this analogy, is you receiving an SMS and tells you your car has just crashed into a wall, right? Versus receiving an SMS that tells you your brake is breaking down, your brake efficiency is at 80% or 60%, your brake oil is at certain efficiency level, and so on and so forth. So that's where attack prevention is about, right? We don't want to just detect attack. Obviously, there are a lot of solutions. I'm sure a lot of enterprises, and your enterprises probably have a very good attack detection. But attack detections are not always on point, right? And if attack detection is on point, we wouldn't see a lot of attack happening right now with ransomware and data exfiltrations attack coming in and going on about in 2022, right? Every major incident that happens right now, if you look at the news, like a Japanese car manufacturer, and then some of the shipping containers companies and banks and stuff like that, they obviously have very, very strong EDR and antivirus there, right? But still, attack happen. And on average, 26% of major incidents were identified by corporate detection tools. But even though you are able to identify and look for an attack, but the fact is attack has happened, right? So a pretty good way to stop an attack, to not even have an attack, is to do proactive maintenance on whatever system that you have. And one of the most prized asset and a crown jewel in your organization is your Active Directory. And that's where Tenable AD comes in. And the second thing is there are a lot of technique about Active Directory that can bypass EDR and antivirus. Today, you don't actually need to run the actual minicats on the machine itself. You can run it remotely. You can run it from a memory. You can even run minicats and run certain type of attack away from a non-domain joined PC. You can bring in a virtual machine that is not domain joined, and you'll be able to run those attacks as well away from the actual corporate network that is being monitored as well to evade detection. Right?
Yeah.
So in summary,
I would say things may be got more complicated if your organization allowed to run Dockers. You can make it inside Docker.
Yeah. And fortunately, I think we have, I believe we have a solution for that in Tenable, Tenable.cs. So Docker is one of those things that people are getting worried about, because you can spin up a container very, very fast. And the container, you can run Rubius, you can basically create a container that is essentially prioritizing attacking tools, right? So we have, those are some of the conversations that we probably will have, but not enough time to talk about today. Right, so and then people will be asking, okay, makes sense that we need to track changes in Active Directory. Obviously, ADR and AD is not enough, but would SIEM be enough then? Because SIEM essentially is a data warehouse that collects Active Directory changes. not just Active Directory change, right? Your routers is sending those changes, your server are sending those changes, your switches and network devices, your VPC Wi-Fi, right? You get the idea. That has sending changes to your SIEM almost every second, right? Every second you receive all the changes, 100 of them, thousands of them into your SIEM. Now, SIEM is great when it comes to receiving changes, but they are not that great when we are trying to identify a very specific scenario. If you go to your SIEM team and ask them, I would like to know about a signature about Kerberos attack, right? And that essentially is trying to find a needle in the sand, right? So in this particular analogy, we are trying to find Waldo in this particular puzzle, right? So that's essentially what is going to happen if you go to your SIEM and ask, I want to find out if there's a golden ticket attack or if there's a Kerberos attack, right? It's very, very hard, especially with a limited AD skills when it comes to when it comes to identifying attack. Not to mention that certain type of attack do not even have event log, or you do not even have traces that comes into the event log, essentially being blinded by the SIEM, right? But what is good with SIEM? Obviously, there are use cases for SIEM. The SIEM is great when it comes to auditing, when it comes to post-incident attack. But it's not really great when it comes to real-time proactive Active Directory attack or proactive remediations of Active Directory, right? Because SIEM do not have those built-in tools to help you to identify whether the changes made on your AD, whether it is safe in your environment, right? And the vendor may tell you, hey, we have tested these configurations in our lab, and so far it's good. There's nothing much. This attack cannot be run. It's not susceptible to Kerberos attack in our environment, which is great. But your environment obviously is not a lab. The lab has limited functionalities. The lab has limited users. The lab has limited configurations that may not be the same and identical to your environment. And those reassurances are great, but essentially they are not the same. So what is going on with that is essentially we need to do security analysis and identifying missing security checks within your environment, right? Whether it's unpatched vulnerability, which is very common, right? It's very easy to be done. We have Tenable, bunch of software that can do unpatched vulnerability checking for you. But the most important thing is about your misconfigurations on Active Directory, whether those misconfigurations make sense in your environment. So obviously we have a lot of different misconfigurations that we have identified with Tenable.ad. And we're gonna share with you some of those that we have seen in our customer environment. And I would say this is definitely something that you will have problem with because we see this all the time in our prospects, in our POV and POCs and current customers environment as well. Number one is the administrative privilege, all right? So what is administrative privilege? In Active Directory, the most commonly known privilege are domain admin or enterprise admin. But obviously, there are GPO schema, there are backup admins, and so on and so forth. Each of those admins can do certain things, and those certain things can lead to a specific attack path. I will show you what attack path later on as well. But in this case, we are not even talking about the built-in admins. We're not talking about backup admins, GPO schema, and so on and so forth. But we are talking about the access control list and the access control entries of sensitive objects. So I'm not sure how many of you would know what are the sensitive objects in Active Directory. They are, for example, they are the domain controller objects. They are the KRBTGT account. They are the admin SD holder, placeholder in Active Directory. They are the GPO object in your Active Directory as well, especially those governs the group policy of your domain controller. Those are sensitive objects. But on top of those sensitive objects, there are also access control lists and access control entries that are rarely in the spotlight to be audited. So over here, if you have the time, use a tool like AD Explorer to dig into, especially your KRBTGT account, and see who have control over this KRBTGT. And you'll be surprised that some random users or some random application like SolarWinds or like maybe even Tenable AD service account would have access to those highly sensitive Active Directory that you do not know about or you have no knowledge about, right? So that's administrative privilege. The second common misconfiguration that we see is about delegation. And it's a feature provided by Active Directory to do impersonation. In a very short summary, what it means is if let's say Disney can have the properties to do or configuration to do delegation, what it does is Disney can use my passport to enter any country he wants, right? So that's essentially its delegation. So I'm allowing Disney to use my passport, or the government is allowing Disney to use another identity like my own passport to access or to enter a country of his choosing. So that's what essentially delegation is, and it's a legitimate feature, right? So when you run audit tool, it may not flag up anything because it's a legitimate features by Active Directory. There's no reason why audit will tell you not to use it. But at the same time, if properly used, when it becomes a problem, it will become a problem. So let's say I'm a delegate, I'm a diplomat, right? Maybe I'm a prime minister or something, and I'm allowing Disney to use it. Obviously, that will create a lot of problems. But you may be able to use other people's identity when they are not sensitive. So those relationships with Active Directory will have to be identified in order for us to decide whether delegation makes sense on certain object or certain user in the organization, right? So those object forms a part of our attack pathway, which we'll talk about in the next couple of slides. And then we also talk about GPO. So AD is not just about users, it's not just about computers. Every day you wake up and then you sign into your computers, that's going through the AD. And then some of you may notice that your wallpaper are being configured, your sleeping timeout, or how often or how long your laptop will log itself out. It all depends on the corporate compliance policy, right? And where does this policy usually come from? They come from the GPO. So GPO can do a lot of mundane stuff, like changing a wallpaper, changing your lockout time, changing your battery policies. But they can also do a lot of highly sensitive stuff as well. They can run certain tools, they can run certain commands, they can send over certain PowerShell scripts to you to run certain things in Active Directory. I'm sure you know that, right? So we would definitely want to be, or very interested to be, how the GPO rights are being assigned. Who can change the GPO, right? In this example, this is the GPT TMPL-INF file. Let me just point to that with this pointer, right? There's a GPT.inf file. And that file, if you look at the permission, most likely you will see some random and unknown user having permissions to change it. And being able to change that file allows them to run potentially scripts in your environment or your workstations or a domain controller, even if it's not properly configured. So do check that out if you're interested to know how much configurations or misconfigurations is happening in your Active Directory. So obviously, that's not just the 3 of them. In Tenable AD, we check 180 rule set of them. So what we wanted to achieve here is mitigate existing threats. Your Active Directory probably are very old, maybe 20 years or 10, 15 years of Active Directory, and all these configurations becomes a problem for you to even manage. We have customers that tells me it is a 20 years old Active Directory. Who knows what has been changed throughout that 20 years, and some of them may have retired even, and no one is keeping track, right? Back then, there's no change tracking, there's no change requests. Those are very foreign, like in the 2000 and over, right? So when we go and look at the Active Directory, there are tons of different changes or tons of different vulnerabilities that has been inherited from years ago, right? So Active Directory is not just like your workstation. You can just reformat it and then you get a brand new PC to use it. Active Directory rarely are that. You just keep upgrading it to the latest version, but the old features and the old configuration will still exist there, right? So the second thing is you want to maintain your security. Not only you want to fix that, but to continuously identify new vulnerabilities in your Active Directory. If there's a change in the AD, or if there's a new configurations or vulnerability being identified by our researchers, want to be able to look at your AD and tell you whether those configurations still make sense in 2022, right? And obviously, we want to also detect attack. I'm sure you have heard of golden ticket attack, silver ticket attack, DC shadow, Kerberos, DC sync. All those type of attack is something that Tenable AD wants to do and wants to help you to identify and detect as well. So we are doing proactive and reactive remediation, proactive remediations and reactive detections of your on Active Directory with Tenable.ad. So I promised to show you before we end the call some of our what do we mean by attack path. So attack path essentially is our core engine to identify specifically your environment, whether those configurations make sense or not. Now, over here we entered SpongeBob, which is the origin of the user account, to an actual admin account in my Active Directory. So as you can see, SpongeBob has an indirect attack path to change or to take over admin account, right? This may exist in my environment, may not exist in your environment. And that's where it becomes very important for us to have the attack path to tell you whether what we have identified in the indicator of exposure is false positive or not. And in this case, we tell you, hey, this SpongeBob guy has some SID history in its active to a different user, and the user basically is a service account which is part of domain admin groups, and obviously the domain admin group has an implicit takeover right of the Active Directory. So that attack path can be very complicated as well. It can be as complicated as multiple attack pathways. So using SpongeBob, I can access or I can compromise different object and sensitive accounts in my Active Directory. Now, like I say, this happened in my lab. And this, if you have a SID history injection or configurations error in your environment, this may not be the same attack path. Now, this attack path formed the core engine of for us to proactively tells you to fix SpongeBob, right? To not allow SpongeBob with this much configurations at hand. And like I said, it can go super complicated like this one here. You can see more than 10 different pathways to reach out to SpongeBob themselves. And then, and this is just another example of someone having the right to reset the password of the sensitive account.
Yeah, this one is also, this one is kind of reduced because like if we zoom out a bit, it will be more complicated. I guess like the base idea is, like Kenneth said, we have like built-in 180 rules to already help you to identify all these risks. But a lot of customers want to, hey, I want to visualize the risk or I want to do some manual audit. So that's why our tools also allow you to do so. Yeah. Thank you, Kenneth, for your closing.
Thanks, Disney. Yeah. Yeah. So that's right. So not only we want to visualize it, like Disney has said, we are also using this to reduce the false positive rate that we are seeing on when you do audit. I'm sure you are able to relate to me. You look at the audit report of the Active Directory, you see tons of different configurations, and when you go to your team and they say, hey, this makes sense. I mean, we need this, and this is safe because we don't have that, right? Because the audit report do not have the context that we have with the attack path and cannot help you to identify whether that is false positive. They just tell you in a static basis that that configuration is bad, right? So with that, I'm going to pass it back to the organizer. And thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Disney, Kenneth. Definitely, we learned a lot from you guys about the AD misconfiguration stuff and also how to remediate it. And what I see is there's a Q&A question from the floor. The question is, if my Log4j system are running on Linux, will hackers still able to query my AD? Very interesting questions. Yeah. So maybe.
Yeah, definitely. Definitely. So you don't actually have to use a Windows system to query your Active Directory. Active Directory actually works well with Linux as well. So even though it's not domain join, even though Linux now can do domain join with the modern Linux, even though the links are not going to domain join, they can still query your Active Directory. In fact, a lot of attacker tools, I forgot what's the name, but a lot of attacker tools run on Linux only because they know that some of the EDR and some of the antivirus do not scan Linux. They don't have the capability to scan Linux subsystem. So they run on the Linux, the tools run on Linux, and they will be able to query your AD. So to answer your question, yes, even if the Log4j is run on Linux, it do not prevent it from it do not prevent your Active Directory from being compromised and being queried.
Yeah, that's
Okay.
very good points. That we can have more understanding on this. So I do want to thank our speakers today, Candice, Disney, Chris, and Liz. And yeah, especially thank you so much for joining us today. And then I pass to maybe our marketing team to wrap the call.
Yes. Thank you. Thanks, Daniel. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. Chris, Liz, Kenneth, and Disney. I think it's a very, very fruitful sharing today. Not just about how Log4j cannot be ignored, but also about securing the Active Directory is important by Tenable and stepping up on the network detection and response with ExtraHop, and of course moving towards SASE with the SSE stack via the Netskope solutions. I think from Singtel, really security, achieving cyber resiliency is a partnership, is a teamwork, and I really appreciate everyone's time for sharing, and of course you, the audience, for your time joining us. So thank you. Have a good lunch. Before you go away, maybe just take a survey of feedback. Really, your feedback is greatly appreciated. And at the end of the feedback form for the submission, we will be emailing you the exclusive Fast and Relevant report that we have. So goodbye, everybody. See you again.
Thank you. Stay safe, stay healthy. Yeah.
Thank you. Thanks, Derek. Thanks, Daniel. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.